Thank you for attending this episode, which I believe is number 19. Don't really care. Is this real life? I don't know what day it is of Worldwide Slot Car Chat. I'm your host, Greg Gaub, Seattle area slot car racer, 1/32nd scale, digital, analog, yada, yada, yada. Today we have Al Schwartz on video, John Kitt, Luff Linkert, and Lloyd. I forget your last name, Lloyd, but I guess it doesn't really matter too much. What's your last name, Lloyd?
I've come back on. There you go. Lewis. Lewis. Yeah.
It's like a superhero surname, Lloyd Lewis, alliteration.
Of course it is, yeah.
Awesome. And we got other people without video. Looks like we've got Ray, who's been on before, and Mr. Chris Walker is here. So it looks like we have lots of wonderful experts on lots of wonderful things. Does anybody have any news or show and tell? Lloyd, did you want to tell the world a little bit? Oh, Al, go ahead. What you got?
Well, I've got a little show and tell that might be amusing. I think probably most of the people here follow Slot Forum. Now, there has been a discussion in the scratch building section lately of the 1939 Mercedes Grand Prix cars. The W165, which was the 1.5 liter car built for the Tripoli Grand Prix, and the W154/M163 3-liter car, which was the standard for the year. As it happens, I am working on models of both of those cars. And while there may at one time or another been bodies available for those particular cars, I couldn't find them, so it's been a carve-it-yourself project. Now, I'm going to show you some things. These are very much a work in progress, so there needs to be a little kindness. I thought the thing which was interesting was the dramatic contrast in size between the 3-liter car and the 1.5 liter car.
Wow. So which one's 3-liter? I assume the bigger one is 3-liter.
3-liter. This is the 165 1.5 liter car. Now, when I put them side by side, I was a bit surprised too. So I went back to the literature and I checked the published specs. And I looked, these were both carved from model maker plans. I checked the published specs, and while there is some variation in some of the specs, at least so far as I can tell, length and wheelbase of these two bodies are good within I would say plus or minus a millimeter. I just thought it was interesting that they're I thought the contrast was greater than I expected it to be.
For those of us like myself who do not carve in any way, shape, or form, I don't even whittle a stick down to nothing. Can you kind of gloss over how where you start from and how you get there? Okay.
Both of these are done in a, they're not wood. It's a, I don't know if you can't see much of it. There's it's a pattern maker's foam, which has the advantage of having no grain and being relatively easy to carve. And what I do is I start out with a block of about the appropriate shape of this foam. I make copies of the model maker plans. And this goes back to sort of model ship building days. I will glue the side view onto the block. And then I will take my little jigsaw and I will cut out the profile. The next part gets sort of interesting, because if you just put a top view on that profile, since the side view is already curved, the top view is going to come off short. So the next stage is to take the cutoff from that top view and temporarily tack it back onto the profiled model. Take the top view from the plans, tack that temporarily onto the top view and back to the jigsaw. Having done that, I will then go and in the case of the model maker plans, there are typical section views of the shapes, and I will glue those to pieces of cardboard, cut them out, and use those to guide the initial shaping. These two are an interesting exercise, probably the most difficult that I've ever done, because unlike most models or most cars, which are, they're either flat or rounded, and the rounding is usually a relatively constant radius. The curves on these two are very subtle. And there has been a lot of, filing and, spray on a coat of primer to see what it looks like, and oh my God, and back with a filler and filing again. The only other thing which might be of interest, and I'll make a couple of comments here on the louvers. Now, louvers are a very important part of the appearance of any 1930s car. Louvers are also a flat pain in the ass. The old SMAC kits may do with essentially miniature corrugated paper, which you glued on. That's pretty good. The problem with that is that if you look at these cars, the louvers were not raised, they were sunken. That's number one. The second thing is, how close do you space the louvers? And here is where, at least in my mind, you move from accuracy to art. My first thought of using the louvers was to let in some pieces of wide electrical, Ziploc ties. Well, that was not quite right, and I couldn't find them in the right section. So then I tried something else, and what I did was I took a piece of pattern maker's wax. This is a very hard wax which can be used in various machining operations to create a pattern which will be accurate dimensionally to the finished product. And I engraved that with a conical bit in a Dremel, a series of lines. I use a little tool, which perhaps I'll pull it out later and put it up for show, called an acromill. And this is a little gadget which you clamp your Dremel into, and it gives you a reasonably controlled, screw-controlled X, Y, and Z axis. Now, can you work to thousandths in this? No. But 5 thousandths, yeah, it's pretty good at that. So I cut some louvers in the wax, and I made a rubber casting of that, and then I cast up some resin louvers, which I could then let into the surface of the model. And here's where the problem arose. I could get a pretty good measurement of the spacing of the louvers by looking at a nice plan view photograph of the car and measuring the space between the louvers and comparing that to the known dimension of the wheels. Just a matter of, numbers and a little bit of division. So I made up my first louvers that way. And I put them on the car, and they just did not look right. They were too small. Accurate in terms of number, accurate in terms of spacing, but on the model, somehow they disappeared. So I went back, and what I found is that I have to nearly double the spacing between the louvers to get the right, quote, feel when they're on the model. Lesson in there somewhere, I suppose.
So there was a lot of trial and error. How many louver tests did you end up doing until you got to what looked good?
Well, it wasn't all that difficult. I mean, it sounds like a big deal, but all I did was take my block and, run a section on it at one spacing and then move it over a little bit and run a section on it at another spacing and so on. So it took me probably 3 tries to get to a louver that I was satisfied with. So I'm in the process now of casting those up, and I'm going to inlet those into the shells. The last point that brings me to, again, something which is discussed at some length in the forum, is the variation in the cars from race to race. This is most readily seen when you look at the louver patterns. They varied from race to race. I guess things got hotter, got cold, or what the issue was. But it's difficult to find pictures, one race to another, where the placing, pattern, and overall outline of the louvered section is the same.
So then your artistic compromising is historically accurate.
Well, let's say I get away with it. There is a whole field of discussion
Oh, I'm sure.
about the translation of dimensions into proper appearance when you start scaling things down to model size. Simply because the point of view at which you look at the model and you look at the real thing, whether it be by eye or camera, are different. So the shapes do appear a little different. And sometimes it's necessary to fudge a little bit to make it, quote, look right.
I haven't been following the discussion, but now I'm, of course, interested, so I'll probably go look it up just so I can see all the goings on. But I'm curious if there are people who are saying things like, I was there at, a race that had this car, or I've seen one, in a museum or whatever, and so I remember it looked like this one, not like that one. Or counting your rivets.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, there is certainly some of that. Certainly in the case of these cars, most of the people who are above ground have seen them in museums and not on the track.
And in which case, most of them have been restored beyond what they would have looked like back in the day.
Of course, that's particularly notable in the finish. If you look at the cars in the Mercedes Museum, they have beautiful, high gloss, probably acrylic finishes. If you look at the photographs, even though they're black and white, you can tell that, it was sprayed on aluminum paint.
Yeah, or in some cases, especially for the Germans, yeah, they didn't have any paint, which is why the silver arrows were silver.
Right. It's rather like an observation I made. I use airbrushing for my finishes, and I can't resist, I have to confess, doing a decent airbrushing and then putting a nice 2-part clear finish over it, which makes it absolutely bulletproof, but it makes it shiny. Back in the day, in the 50s, and I was there, you look at some of the, particularly the Ferraris, or the Italian cars in general, mostly looked as if they'd been painted with the same broom that was used to sweep the shop floor.
In which case they probably were.
They were, well, you could tell in many cases looking at them that the bodies were hand hammered over wooden bucks because they weren't all even that smooth. I had a friend who had I forget which one it was. It was a little Ferrari coupe, not one of the racing ones, but one of the little coupes they built in the early 50s. And he bent it one day and had to take it in the body shop. And he said he was astounded at the amount of filler there was under the paint.
Did the body shop pound out the hammer dents? And
Well, they did some of that.
I probably did.
The bigger problem was the bumpers. Beautiful bumpers on the car. And as bumpers, they were absolutely useless because they were chrome-plated brass.
The filler might have just been pasta.
That could have been. Well, I mean, I have always insisted, for example, that the basic technology at Magneti Marelli was running copper wire through linguini with about the same level of durability.
Well, that's really cool. And you're hand carving them out of this special foam stuff.
Yeah.
It's,
They're designed, I missed the first one, they're designed for a proxy race, which hopefully will occur, which has been retitled the Mac Pinches Memorial Race.
Now, Alan, how dense is this foam that you can sort of, you have to use a jigsaw? It must be fairly dense stuff.
No, I mean, the jigsaw, you could do it with a coping saw. I happen to have a jigsaw and I'm lazy.
I mean, you could probably do it with a craft knife. I mean, it sounds like it's really dense. The bubbles being super, super small.
Yeah.
Expanded styrofoam, like florists use stuff. Does it crush easily?
No.
Okay.
No.
So it's stronger than florist stuff.
Now, I mean, I have a problem with my hands, and they're a little weak because of carpal tunnel problems. But I'm squeezing on this as hard as I possibly can, and it's not moving.
There's confidence right there.
So what type of filler were you using? Were you using Bondo or Tamiya filler or?
At this stage, I use Squadron Green.
Oh, okay.
Because it sets up very quickly. If there's an area where I'm going to have to do a lot of fine carving, I'll use, the hell is that? It's that British epoxy.
Milliput.
Right, that one, yeah. And that, it takes a while to harden up, but you can do some preliminary shaping with that with a wet finger, which works out very nicely.
Dennis, it sounds like you've got some experience in that realm. Do you have anything that you want to tell the masses about carving from scratch? Do you ever carve?
Absolutely no experience whatsoever, but I read a lot and I remember what I read, and that's the only way I know about milliput.
That's the only way I know about lots of stuff.
I haven't carved a body since probably 1966 or so, and it was a little Ferrari 312 for Formula One that went on top of then it would have been 67 or 8 because it had all the bundle of snakes exhausts on the back that I made out of fuse wire or some little wire, white covered wire, that it went onto a monogram 1/32 scale chassis, the ones that used to carry the 158 and the Lotus 33. And I decided I wanted something different, so I made up one out of balsa wood, painted it and detailed it, and put wound all these little pieces of wire together, and 2 ferrules of 2 small paintbrushes for the megaphones at the back. And I wish I had photographs of it, but I don't. It's way too long ago. But it was fun.
So for back then, did you hollow out the balsa, and the balsa was the actual body? Yeah,
the balsa was the body, and it wasn't even hollowed out. I built it out of pieces. I built a box and then I rounded the outside. Although at the time, I mean, there was a lot of bodies that were made from blocks of balsa. The guys would carve the body out of balsa wood and then screw all the mechanicals into them at the time, and coats and coats of dope or some kind of hardening material on the outside to harden them up, but they didn't last very long.
No, I would imagine a crash or two would take care of it.
Yeah, especially when you had a pitman inside it or something like that with a brass plate chassis underneath it. They didn't last very well. It was the first slot cars that I ever saw that were running at any kind of competitive speed were like that, and that would have been 1960, maybe 66, somewhere around there.
So Al, so you're gonna resin cast. You're gonna cast those and do resin, I assume.
Well, it's sort of resin.
Well, how would you differ what you're going to do with what we saw John do a few weeks ago?
Okay, I'm not sure. I may have missed that, but
Well, he did the whole vacuum, well, not vacuum, but pressurized chamber with the silicone molds, and poured in the resin, mixed the resin, poured it in, put it in the chamber.
okay. I don't have the pressure chamber. I use the silicone molds. I have been doing this long enough, so the first time I built a body from a mold, the mold was not a two-part silicone. The mold was a liquid latex, which you painted on, let it set up, paint another layer on, put some cheesecloth on that, painted that on, and built up 5 or 6 layers of cheesecloth plus latex, and then you had a mold. What I do in these,
No, go ahead.
what I do with these is I make the, I make a simple one-piece rubber mold. I pour in a very minimal amount of resin, slosh that around, and form a very thin resin shell, nowhere near thick enough to be self-supporting. Let that harden up, and then I laminate in, depending on what I'm feeling like at the moment, either a very thin carbon fiber or a very thin Kevlar scrim in epoxy, and put in probably 2 layers of that. End up with a very thin and very light body, which is, to all intents and purposes, bulletproof.
Wow. I mean, when you started, I'm like, oh, slush cast. He's just kind of, sloshing it around and, making sure. And then Kevlar and carbon fiber. Wow, that's next level.
Yeah, and I have no concerns about using carbon fiber in my models. I realize that carbon fiber can have some nasty effects. That's if you're sitting and working with it all day, every day.
Yeah, don't breathe it in.
Don't breathe it in. Cutting a few small strips of carbon fiber and putting them into epoxy. I do a lot of other things that are probably far more hazardous than that.
Yeah, as long as you keep it away from 1/32 scale people, they'll be fine.
That's right. Yeah. Well, now, it's sort of funny. I've had this argument with people. Yes, I'm always reaching for my cigarette here, along with my whiskey. There are some reports, absent from the reporting in the United States, because after all, in this country, smoking is only one step up from child molestation. That in a couple of studies, they have found that habitual smokers are 5 times less likely to contract and be affected by the coronavirus than non-smokers.
I've heard that type O blood or something like that is also low on the list, and I think I'm that type. So
well, it turns out that nicotine has some antiviral properties.
Nice. Well, I mean,
It may also be true.
Right here.
It may also be true for slot cars.
That could be.
None of us have it.
There you go.
I picked this out of my box of tricks here, just as one of the things. This is a 1/24 scale Sauber C9 Group C car. Comes from a guy in Germany. He's a Nigerian guy who lives in Germany. His name is Fola Osu. And this is the raw body that he makes. And this one is being made that same way with carbon fiber internal. And then this very, very thin gel coat so that you get very nice details on the outside. I've still got a lot of cleaning up and to do on it. But I just thought I'd let you guys see it who haven't done it. And Alan, I presume this is very close to what you would be doing, right?
Very similar, yes.
Yeah, and that's a 124 scale body, and that thing weighs 11 grams.
Wow.
Yeah, just
Wow.
nothing. 11 grams. I weighed it now. It'll be a bit more once it's got paint on it and its wings and interior and so on. But I mean, you might as well have it might as well be a vacuum formed body just about.
Right.
Like,
You can probably take it and twist it back and forth with no ill effect. Yeah.
Nice. All right, John, when are you going to start putting that in your?
Yeah, really? Yeah, that's a great idea. Holy cow. Jeez. So I wonder if there's a way to actually, since if you've got molds already made, to sort of incorporate that into what you're building.
Sure, why not? You know, it's the same process, just when instead of putting in enough resin to make a finished body, put in just enough to give you a nice coat over the surface.
Right. Extract the volume of your carbon fiber mat from the volume that you would be using for liquid resin.
Exactly, and the reason I do that is the resin is a very nice surface to work with for finishing. You don't have to worry about any matte pattern showing through.
Wow. Or if you really want to be cool, if you're using like a modern car, you could use a clear resin and let the matte show through.
Then you'd see all the strips, though. You'd see.
Well, depending on how they line up, though, that like for something like that Dennis showed us, because a lot of modern cars show the carbon fiber, if not in whole or in part, like
Yeah.
on front wings, for example. Okay, gee, thanks, guys. It's not like I got a lot more to do, but.
Well, the material I use, by the way, is not a woven fabric.
Oh,
It's a random chopped mat.
So there's some kind of binding agent holding that.
There's a binding agent holding it together, yes.
so maybe it has resin already in it?
Or maybe like paper, some kind of a.
I don't know what it is. Material like this is typically made with an additive which will make it readily wettable.
So it's made for that purpose, it sounds like, or a
Yes.
similar purpose, that
Yeah.
kind of purpose.
Yeah, there is precedent for this in, particularly in fiberglass boat hull manufacture, full size, where they will often use a woven cloth as the first layer, and then use a gun which applies a chopped strand glass plus resin at the same time to build it up further.
Well, I think I'm going to give I know a few guys who repair carbon fiber hockey sticks. I wonder if they use the same sort of material.
Don't know. I don't even recall, you know, I can't recall where I bought mine from. It was so long ago. As I recall, I bought 2 yards of each. And I've barely scratched the the surface in terms of use. It does not take a lot of cloth to do a 1/32 body.
Are you doing multiple layers, or pretty much just trying to get at least one layer of strip in as much of the car as you can?
It's one layer of strip, but because particularly Kevlar is not particularly flexible. Kevlar is quite stiff. Carbon fiber is stiff as well. It's made up of small pieces. It's a patchwork quilt.
And the resin holds it together.
All right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's super cool.
The ideal combination, of course, because in any resin plus fiber, whether it be glass, Kevlar, carbon, any resin fiber layup, the strength improves as the fiber to resin ratio improves. The resin is there simply as a connector. Using a process like this with a vacuum form system, which will squeeze out excess resin, would be ideal.
I have a vacuum chamber because I use a vacuum chamber when mixing silicone to get the vapor out from
Yeah.
mixing the A and the B. Well, that's basically like not quite an autoclave, is it?
No, an autoclave is pressure.
Pressure, right? Yeah. So what? Well, why would you use? You wouldn't use pressure instead of vacuum?
Well, you could.
I mean, vacuum is basically allowing the atmospheric pressure to, well,
Exactly.
not taking away the atmosphere.
Yeah, you're removing it, which is a real problem for resins because once you do that to a resin, they bubble up like crazy.
Right.
It's because it's an exothermic reaction, whereas you want to sort of press it right into, because when you're making carbon fiber parts, they put them into an autoclave.
But isn't an autoclave heat as well?
Yeah, it's heat and pressure. Yes. Yeah, which is why the resin I was using is exothermic to begin with. So that's why you really only need pressure for itself. Yeah, this is gonna okay. Hi, I need some carbon fiber, Matt.
All right, Lloyd's got something. What you got?
Yeah, on that carbon fiber, what does it look like? Is it thin pieces? How do you make it take the shape of the mold you're doing? Because you said it was fairly rigid.
Yeah, you cut it into little pieces.
You cut it in little pieces. Right?
Yes.
You just got to have a decent pair of shears to cut it. It's not like super hard to cut or anything.
No. Cuts a pair of scissors cuts it. No problem.
How small are the fibers? I mean, can you look at it and see the fibers, or are they just like powderized? They're so small you can barely see them.
No, you can see them. You can see the fibers. Well, go on with other things. I'll see if I can find a piece of it.
All right, other things. Earlier, I was going to have Lloyd kind of tout his 1/43rd scale Zoom chat. Do you want to kind of give us a little, hey, come, if you're interested in 1/43rd, come to my chat thing for us, Lloyd?
Yeah, but looking at the people you got there, none of them do 1/43rds.
Are we welcome even though we're a larger scale?
He didn't kick me out.
Well, we come on here. I come on here and listen to all you got to say, and I learn an awful lot that is applicable to my scale. So it probably works the other way as well to some degree. I find it very amusing when I see things in Slot Forum about, I made a 1/32nd model Sprite, and I had great trouble finding mechanicals to fit into it. A 1/32nd model Sprite is quite large to me. You can make them as small as you want. It's just a matter of adapting to the scale you're using. Some people make very tiny little models with lots of detail in them. It's just a matter of adapting your head to suit what you're doing now, really. The Zoom meeting, as I say, I was influenced very much by this one. But whereas Greg sits there nice and calmly doing this, I'm flapping away and hoping I'm not waffling too much. The other thing is, you keep people on a mute until it's ready to speak. I didn't do that, so we were talking over each other a little bit, but not too badly. But I will put it on mute to start with next time. Sorry.
I was going to say you have to be careful of that, otherwise.
I can get in on that one. Yeah.
Go ahead, John.
I was going to say you have to be careful of that, otherwise you got a video of Tourette's.
I mean, just do it however you feel comfortable. You know, you're going to have a different group of people, and people who are watching this, who've been watching this or watching, you know, and they're like 1/43rd, and they might be coming because they know Lloyd is likely to be on here, and they might get some 1/43rd stuff. Now, you know, viewers, if you want to participate or watch a 1/43rd focused Zoom chat, Lloyd runs one. Are you doing every Tuesday? I think you said you're going to take a couple of weeks because you got some.
Yeah, normally it's going to be Tuesday seems to work at the moment. I do ask people's opinion, but right now I'll be sticking to Tuesday. But for the next 2 weeks from next week, I'm away, so I'm traveling. I'm thinking of doing one on Monday before I go next week. I'm not sure how the next week will be, so there may be a gap of 2 weeks. but I will be online, so I'll be able to let people know what's going on.
Is the best place to look for the link to your chat going to be Slot Forum, or are you going to post in other places as well?
I use Slot Forum much of the time because I find it's reliable, it gets to people, but it's also on Slot Racer and on Home Racing World.
Okay,
as well as quite a few of the Facebook groups.
So yeah, far and wide.
That's right. I'm letting people know about it.
Yeah.
We had Alan, whose name I can't pronounce because it's long and German, on yesterday. He was across the pond with you in America, and we had you on. The rest are from Britain. But the ones that I'm interested in getting on as well are the ones, because most of the good 143rd work at the moment is being done either in Canada or Northern Europe. But we have a language problem when we start talking in Northern Europe. So I'll just hope we get some translators as well.
To our benefit as English speakers who maybe like me, a lot of people don't speak any other language. Most Europeans are multilingual and speak. I mean, Maurizio Ferrari always impresses me that he's speaking in whatever language he's being interviewed in. He does interviews on this German guy's channel, and he's not fluent, obviously, but he's holding his own. You know, speaks fluent English, obviously Italian. I'm sure he probably speaks Russian, for crying out loud.
Compared to the people in Europe, we are very lazy, us English speakers. Most of them, but in the hobby, I've been surprised how many people in France or Germany and other places do not speak English. There's quite a few, but I would imagine with the internet, that more and more people will be using English as well.
We certainly have no reason to or no right to get upset with them for not learning our language. Just
not at all, no.
In some cases, it may not be a case of they do not speak English. It may be a case of they will not speak English.
Yeah.
The French tend to be a little like that.
All right, be nice.
As South Africans, we always used to say, if you're in Paris and you need to ask something, walk up to a Frenchman and start speaking to him in Afrikaans, which is our second language. He won't understand you, but at least he knows you're not a pommy. Right?
Alan, I saw you had some of your carbon fiber there. Do you want to show that off again?
Yeah. Well, first we'll start out. This is,
it's not black.
No. Well, this is the Kevlar.
Okay.
All right.
And I'm holding it up with my hand behind it.
Yeah.
So you can see how thin it is.
Oh, we can even see you behind it.
Yeah.
Right. It's really very thin.
Yeah.
There's no discernible grain because it is just a random mat. And the carbon fiber, a bunch of cleaning up to do after this session is over, is similar.
Yeah.
This is the carbon fiber. As you can see, it's very thin.
Benzoyl, yeah.
I don't have my micrometer around, but just using the finger calipers, it's less than 1,000.
I would imagine. I mean, 20-pound paper is like 1/10 of a mil, so that's probably 100th or 1,000. Yeah. So it's fairly flexible.
What do you paint it in? Sorry, carry on.
Go ahead, Lloyd.
What do you paint it into the car with when you're painting it in?
I use epoxy, and I use epoxy for two reasons. Number one, unlike polyester resins, which cure very quickly, epoxy is slow curing, requires some patience, but also when it's cured, it is flexible. Whereas again, polyesters tend to be brittle. The epoxy that I use is a material made actually for full-size boat building, and it is specifically formulated to be penetrating, highly wetting,
Yeah.
so that just painting it on, and I just use what, well, I guess this is probably a universal tool, the typical metal-handled acid brushes that are used for plumbers use for soldering and so on and so forth. Fairly stiff bristle, disposable, because you buy them in packets of 50. And I sure as hell don't want to try to clean epoxy out of a brush.
Yeah.
And they serve as both a conveyor of the resin and as a tamper to push the fabric down into the resin. Then you simply need to be patient. The laminating part of the bodybuilding process is a 2 or 3 day process.
And how many layers do you normally do?
2 to 3, depending on the size of the body and the contours. The flatter the body is, the more coat, the more layers it will receive. If it's something like these, the Mercedes that I just showed earlier, which are heavily curved, I'll use a thinner surface because the curved surface is going to be stronger per se.
Oh, it's just geometrically more stable than...
Right. I mean, for example, the last time I used a 3-part layup was a Ferrari 512. I'm sorry, 612 Can-Am car, which has a back deck of the size of a football field and about as flat. And that needed 3 layers to be reasonably stable.
But like Dennis was showing, you could still flex it.
Oh yeah,
it won't lose its shape just from existing.
Right, and because it's an epoxy resin, it won't crack.
This is what I'm learning today. This is my new something today that I'm learning. That's super cool. If somebody asked me, is there somebody out there laminating carbon fiber into a slot car body? I probably would have said, yeah, probably, but probably not, but maybe. And now it's a thing. It's been a thing for a long time.
Well, here's a question. Could you also use the same similar sort of methodology for something that's 3D printed that may require some strength?
I think 3D printing tends to have a minimum wall thickness just to successfully print. So anything, even with a resin printer where, it's a nice high detail, no layer lines, really nice printing, it's not going to successfully finish a print unless the thickness is a good millimeter, I would imagine. You might be able to get less than a millimeter for the wall thickness of a thing, but it probably would have all kinds of anomalies just because it's not fully cured it's only kind of partially cured, right? One layer is partially cured, and then it, picks up, lets resin fall in between, and then squishes back down, and then partially cures another layer, and then does that over and over. So if your wall thickness isn't capable of doing that, up and down, in and out of the resin multiple times, it's gonna be wonky or fail completely. So just to ensure a successful print, it's gonna have to have some thickness. It's not gonna be paper thin. So probably not necessary, because there's lots of different resins, printing ABS-like resin and flexible resins, and you can mix different kinds of resins to create your own concoction of resin, whether, with some Shore number of some sort. So I'd be surprised to see somebody print something that is so thin they felt the need to do that, other than for just making it stronger in the case of a crash or something like that. But I don't have a resin printer. All I know is that my filament printer can't extrude less than the nozzle width, at least not very, very much less than the nozzle width. And the standard nozzle width on a filament printer is 0.4 millimeters. So that's going to be your thinnest wall, and it's pretty flexible. If I were to print a car body at a 0.4 millimeter wall thickness, just one perimeter of printing, I would probably want to layer in some carbon fiber just to make sure it doesn't get destroyed. But I would only try that if I knew that it would succeed, if it was specifically designed to be printed with only one perimeter. It's basically, there's a special printing mode called vase mode, where it lays down your base layer, and then for the rest of it, it just prints a contiguous, never-ending stream of filament up and up and up and up and up. But that's only possible if the next layer is going to have some purchase on the previous layer, right? So you're not going to do anything near horizontal, you know, it's going to have to be, you know, like that. And you can do all kinds of shapes this way. But if you're trying to lay down a layer that's over here on a layer that's over here, it's not going to happen. So you got to have multiple perimeters, infill, and all that kind of stuff just to have that be successful. Resin has some of the same kind of limitations, but not quite as restrictive as filament printing. But yeah, that's a whole new thing I had never thought of. That you know, Steve was on here a minute ago. Is he still there? I don't see him in the list, but maybe when he watches this later, he's going to say, "Ooh, I'm going to try."
Well, the other possibility I thought is that you do a normal print, Greg, and then you remove material from the inside to like lose weight, and then put the carbon fiber in.
I mean, it's just so much work to try to carve out plastic from the inside of a body. I don't like doing that. I don't do it. I've seen it done, and I've taken one stab at it, and it was such a pain in the butt that I said I would never ever do that again. But the problem with most filament printing, a lot of the more common filaments don't like heat at all, right? Because they just melt. They're designed to melt at relatively low temperatures. So friction causes heat, and so you end up just melting and making a mess of your car. Resin printing, not the same. You know, it's resin, so it's sands. You could probably do that with resin printing, but.
And sanding a slush casting or a two-part casting or a two-part mold casting like John does, it creates so much dust.
Oh, yeah.
Some of them that I've had, the slush cast ones, where you really have to do a lot of grinding inside to get the thing down to erasable weight. You look like a snowman by the time you're done with that.
And cover your protective stuff.
And the other thing too is that dust is not very.
No, not very healthy.
Yeah. No.
But yeah,
I have a solution for that.
Yeah.
I have a solution for that. And this comes from a completely different area. One of the things that I do on a fairly regular basis is go to a foot specialist. And the first thing he does whenever I get there is to retrim the nails that I've sort of crudely trimmed. They're crudely trimmed because arthritis makes it very difficult for me to get my foot into a position where I can easily reach it. And he uses a gadget. I watched him use it, and then I copied it, which is a little grinder with a tube attached to it, which is attached to a vacuum source. Now, I found that my Dremel is permanently ensconced in that acromill that I was talking about before, and I use a Fordham flexible shaft tool for all of my grinding. And I found out that I could fairly easily tape a piece of tubing to that Fordham flexible shaft and run it through an adapter down to my shop vac. And so when I start grinding away, which is something which is going to cause a lot of dust, I take this flexible shaft tool and I turn on the shop vac and I grind away, and probably 80% or more of the dust gets sucked up into the shop vac.
Well, yeah, I guess as long as your shop vac has I guess the appropriate bag or filter or whatever, it's not recirculating back into the room.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's got a pretty good filter on it.
That's clever. That's
Yeah,
good.
I've done that with routers when you're routing an MDF track.
Yeah.
Same sort of thing. I'll large amounts of duct tape, and you tape something onto the router and attach that to the shop vac, and you have almost no dust at all.
Exactly.
It works pretty well, and Luff will know about that.
Yeah, he just has one of his lackeys to follow behind with a vacuum.
You know what I found out? If you wrap a dish towel around the rotor and just let it drag behind the rotor, it keeps all the dust on the MDF. It doesn't get into the air at all.
And then
It does make the rotor hot.
So,
Yeah.
so Luff, you have a ground effects router.
Dust effect, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Colin, you should name your router Colin at least.
Colin, like Kaepernick? No, not.
No, I call
Colin.
Colin
No.
Chapman.
Colin. Okay. I figured it was a racer, but I didn't know the name.
I don't know. I think it'd be more like a Jim Hall router.
That's true. He was it's true. He was the first with the Lexan. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and God bless him, he used the snowmobile engine.
Are you guys talking about like the Chaparral with the vacuum?
Yeah, the sucker car. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, 2J.
Lloyd, you said you were going to have something earlier. What you got?
Yeah, on the same subject. Yesterday, on the 143rd group, I showed the Cortina, the red Cortina, and the chassis of it and everything. And that was soon after that I flew the Cortina off the top of the mountain and crashed it. Because I had a problem. It was binding and it would suddenly let go. So yesterday, I made another resin body for it. And I've spent the afternoon out there cutting and cleaning out the new resin body. And out there is the answer. I sit in the garden and do it.
Yeah. So that nature takes the dust away.
On a windy day, and it just blows it away. But
So all your squirrels basically have emphysema now.
sorry?
All the squirrels in your garden have emphysema now.
Oh yes, the garden has, yeah.
And you never did like the neighbors either, right?
But I just use the normally I just fasten the vacuum cleaner tube on the bench and work in front of it. Does the job.
Mm-hmm.
It's nothing fancy, but it takes away most of the dust.
Yeah, I don't know about you guys. I'm making a list here. Hang on a second.
This is one of the things that 3D printing really shines in is making things adapt to each other that the manufacturers never intended. You've got A brand shop vac and B brand router that don't have the same diameter of things, and so you make an adapter, this diameter and that diameter, and that kind of CAD work is like step one of learning how to do CAD. Draw a circle, draw another circle, make them connect, print it. So one of the groups I'm on, Facebook group, is like printing useful things. That's just the name of the group, 3D printing useful things. And 9 of 10 of the things, the posts you see are people, I needed this bracket that cost $50 from this crazy manufacturer that has a broken bracket on it. So I designed it in CAD and then I printed it up. I needed to adapt my X vacuum to my Y machine, and boom, I printed it up. Not just slot car stuff, people. 3D printing is useful.
Greg, you should rename that group Apollo 13.
And the image can be a roll of duct tape. All right, so we got Weltmeister has joined us, and of course Dennis has joined us earlier. We did have Steve on earlier. He's still not in the list. Maybe
It looks like Phil went to get something. What'd you get there, Phil?
Talking about Weltmeister?
Oh, I know you guys are talking about grounding out slush cast cars. So I was looking at how much work I had to do on a few I have. That's all.
And seeing them and going, later.
Yeah, I don't know. We'll see.
That goes
Yeah,
back on the shelf.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, there we go.
I'm buying these off eBay.
That's a Xerox special.
Yeah, and they're going for about $10 a piece, depending on bidding. So, but I mean, stuff that I haven't been able to find through manufacturers. Here's a Chaparral 1.
Chaparral 1.
So those fairly thick resin casts, just like
This one's rather nice. But yeah, some of these are.
wow.
Oh, that's a slush mold for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, my
Yeah,
son
the,
was.
the thing you have to be, sorry, I was just going to say, the thing you have to be wary of with slush molds, especially if it's not even done, doesn't look like it's done under pressure, there might be air pockets and holes where you don't want them.
Oh yeah, my son, his first, technically his, I mean, depending on who you talk to, his first car that actually drove was, and still is, he still has it, a Carmen Ghia, 71 or 2 or something like that. I forget the year. And it was, I mean, it was a rust bucket, but he loved it because it was a Carmen Ghia. And so I wanted to buy him a Carmen Ghia slot car. Obviously 1/32 scale is what I was looking for. And I found online, I found a resin Carmen Ghia body. And I'm like, okay, I'll order that. And I had a friend that I knew down in Oregon who was well known, Green Man, I'm sure some of you have heard of, makes some really fantastic models out of resin bodies. And we came to an agreement. And so I had the model shipped to him. And when he got it, he's like, oh man, this is just garbage, but I'll give it a try. And, you know, several months later and some, you know, hey, what's the status, you know, where are we at? And he's like, oh geez, you know, I'm trying, but this thing is just so much work. I ended up, you know, visiting him and you know, he ended up just kind of giving me a box with the body and all the parts that he was planning to put in there and saying, sorry dude, I just can't do this. And I took a look at that body and it honestly looked worse than the one that Phil was showing there. It was just, and there were bubbles on the outside of it. I mean, I would have had to, you know, fill and sand and do all that stuff. And interestingly, because it was taking so long because it was such a piece of work that he really didn't want to touch it. I kept kind of looking on eBay for other Carmen Ghia slot cars and bodies and stuff like that. And then I found one that was being sold as the complete kit. I forget the name of the kit manufacturer that was doing it, but it had the bumpers and it had the mirrors and it had you know, glass and stuff like that too. And I was like, okay, well obviously there's even more parts to go with this one. If the body is any better, then I'll be you know, up better off. So I ordered it, and it was so much better. It was a proper thickness. It wasn't super thin, but it wasn't just this crazy lumpy mess. And the very little cleanup work needed to be done. It already had body posts, you know, just kind of putty body posts molded in there for, I forget the name of the chassis, but it was a very common scratch build, you know, adjustable wheelbase chassis that you could put under it. It was basically ready to have a chassis. You know, you buy this chassis and stick it under that car and you're good to go. So I gave the kit to my son. I'm like, here, you do it what you want. Here's the kit. Here's everything you need. There you go. And he basically painted it up as his fantasy, what he plans to do in some point in the distant future to his real Carmen Ghia. You know, blue with a white top and white interior and all that. I still have it out there. It's actually fairly decent. It runs like an Inco Classic. It's pretty cool.
That's cool. Well, Greg, tell your son that really a Carmen Ghia is a poor man's 356.
Yeah.
I mean, it's basically not even VW. It's like, yeah, that's a cool car. He's super proud to have it, even though it's just a rust bucket.
I had a blue with white hood, white roof, whatever you call them over there. 57 Carmen Ghia.
Nice. Yeah. So
And
different.
and I also, just before that, had a 56 Beetle. And I'm sure they were made of lead. Because if you got any damage to the bodywork, you got a rounded hammer out and bang, it would just go back into shape. There was none of this pinging or anything like this. They were just solid lumps. Very easy to knock back into shape.
Just remember, those same folks that built that car built, you know, literally tanks probably.
I've got some common gear bodies in 143rd, but I haven't cast them yet.
Wow. Starting with diecast, I assume.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In Britain, we have a class of racing that was called, I'm just trying to think what it's called in its early form, special saloons. And basically it was a profile shape, and you had things like DAFs and Skodas, but the running gear underneath was often a Lola or a Chevron or something like that, but it had this saloon car side profile, and a couple of them were actual common gears, so that's what I was thinking of having a look at. Their profile looked like the real car, but they're much wider and much lower to the floor, much faster as well.
Sounds like the ultimate resto mod.
Oh yeah, I've got some photos, but I can't put them on here. Maybe I'll put them up sometime.
And
Yeah, my son's plan for the Carmen Ghia is not to restore it; it's to essentially use it as a mold, or a frame or whatever for some kind of carbon fiber body electric car kind of thing. It's like,
Oh right,
he's got grand plans that I'm sure will never happen, but he's
it's a nice shape.
Should be
Well,
like
it's a wonderful shape. It's a beautiful car. I've seen.
Yeah, nice shape.
Well, just Greg, all you have to do is find him a full-scale slot car track.
And then he'll want to do it, right? No, it's his girlfriend scoffs. They've got a 2-car garage, and one of the cars is his Carmen Ghia sitting in there, just stinking up the garage with its oily smell, VW oily smell. She's not real keen on the Carmen Ghia. He's got a Golf TDI or something like that. But yeah, it's fun. I'm sure it'll be basically, once they get a house and he's like, he's doing his old man thing, he'll start actually taking a crack at that. It was enough of a project to get it roadworthy. I mean, the guy he bought it from was driving it around, but he had bolted an old Porsche seat straight to the floor, no adjustments whatsoever. It was just bolted to the floor. And this dude was like a foot taller than my son. So there was no way he was driving that thing safely. It had, I think it might have had a lap belt, but it didn't have any proper restraint. And I'm like, step one is getting that seat so that you can sit in the car and drive it, preferably adjustable, and with a seat belt. And then once he got all that done, he was like, oh man, this is the best. He was like driving to and from school. He was taking auto shop. So he had an auto shop that he could just pull the car into and work on it at school, which was super cool. He loved that. And he kept, the biggest problem was that the guy he bought it from did his own wiring and apparently didn't know how to wire a car. But Alex, my son, didn't know how to wire a car either, right? So he's just driving the car around, and it would die, right? So he'd call me out, Dad, can you jump my car? And so I can get home. And I'm like, I'd go out and I'd jump his car. And then it would, we'd put it on the charger, make sure it was, the battery was good, and ended up changing the battery to a nice fresh battery, still died on the side of the road. We're like, what the heck? He goes and gets the alternator checked to make sure it's functioning properly. Nothing wrong with the alternator. We're like, okay. And he ends up, leaving it at school. He's like working on it for like a week or two. The guy didn't ground things properly. And so it was basically running straight off the battery. The alternator wasn't even doing its job. And we're like, oh, well, now that that's fixed, then it was like, oh, well, this cylinder doesn't have enough pressure. I don't know why. And it's just like, oh, man, just no. But he drove that thing for a good solid year of going to and from high school, you know.
I'll tell you my take on vintage Volkswagens. In 1962, just married, I moved from the East Coast to California, and I made that trip with my new bride in a couple-year-old Hillman Minx, which was not a bad little car, but in the course of traversing the Midwest, which is mostly flat, one of the problems I had was that all the Volkswagens passed me because the Hillman simply could not maintain the sustained highway speed that they were capable of. Howsoever, when we went beyond Kansas and began the approach to the Rocky Mountains and then had to make our way through them, I passed all those goddamn Volkswagens again.
Gutless engines.
They couldn't climb the hills.
About the only saving grace is that they're like one of the nation's most I don't know, popular or busiest or whatever air-cooled engine car part supplier is right on the other side of the freeway from us. So if he ever needed a part for his Carmen Ghia, it was just like, call him up, hey, do you got this in stock? Yeah, I'll be right over. And bada boom, bada bing, he had what he needed. So that was pretty cool.
When we started out with all of our first cars, you either drove a Volkswagen Beetle or you drove a Ford Prefect, not an Anglia, a Prefect, the previous ones to the Anglias, or you drove a Mini, the original Morris Minis. Some had Hillman Imps, but not very many. So you were either a Mini guy or a Volkswagen guy most of the time. And I was a Mini guy. And my Mini was still one of the last of the Minis that had, first of all, a generator rather than an alternator. And secondly, it was positive ground and not negative ground like all the new cars are, okay? And that didn't worry me to start with until I tried to put a car radio into this thing. I got an old radio from my dad, an old Philips, and the Philips radio had a little switch on the back of it, the Philips car radio, that you could switch between positive and negative ground. I'd switch it to positive ground, put it in, and it worked. You know, it was one of those that took like 5 minutes for everything to warm up before you could listen to AM radio or whatever it was. And I decided to get rid of that and put an FM radio in. Went off and bought this fancy little radio, came home to fit it in and looked at it, and it was negative ground only. So now what? And I thought, oh man, what do I do now? You know, because I got this radio, and short of isolating it from the whole car and wiring things up, you know, and I decided that wasn't the way to do it. And so I took the car down to an auto electrician, and for like $20, they reconfigured the whole car, because it's so simple when you have a generator rather than an alternator. Because really all that they did was they swapped the terminals on the battery, and they re-energized the fields of the generator, and Bob's your uncle, it was done. The only thing that I had to change around was I had a little ammeter on the instrument panel. I had to change the ammeter around because it was showing a draw instead of a charge. And that was the end of it. It was the simplest, easiest thing to do. And from then on, my Mini, even though it had a generator, was negative ground wiring. Worked great.
Okay, I've learned two things today.
I got one other little thing for you guys today. When Lloyd was talking about all of this small stuff, I want to try and see if I could share a screen.
Okay, hold on. Let me make sure that's on. Okay.
So if I click here, you'll see I want to show that. Can you see that?
Yep, brass chassis.
All right. Now, that's a brass chassis is what they call a jail door chassis. And to give you some feel about the size of that chassis, there it is next to a 1/24 scale chassis. All right. So the story about this was I was unemployed at one point, and my wife's birthday was coming up, and I didn't know what to do. And so I made this little brass chassis. It's an inch long between the front and rear axle tubes, and it's 3/4 of an inch wide. So it is actually a quarter scale version of the 1/24 scale car that's above it. And it's made out of 0.032 brass rod, and I think this is 16th inside diameter tubing front and rear. And you can't see it in the pictures, but that little motor bracket at the back actually has the holes. If I could find a small enough motor to put in there and small enough gears, I could actually get it to run.
And a drop arm.
And a drop, yeah, I made the drop arm, although the drop arm doesn't drop. I started that solid. Because
Dennis,
yeah.
did you make an appropriately scaled controller to go along with it?
No. Because what I did once I had it all polished up, I polished it till it shone, and then I gave it a clear coat, and I actually hung it on a chain by a little link around the back end of that little loop that's around the back of the motor bracket. I hang it by a chain, and she wears it as jewelry.
You had it made two. If you had it made two, she would have had a nice set of earrings, Dennis.
Yeah, they're a little big for earrings, Chris. Anyway.
That's absolutely brilliant. It is jewelry.
Yeah, nice piece of work.
Thank you. Yeah, I do that every now and then.
What about one of those little new HO can motors?
It'd have to be even smaller than some of those. I think we'd probably have to go looking at those little motors that they use in the tail rotors of the small helicopters.
Yeah.
Have you
You've
ever
got plenty of tiny motors.
Have you ever seen the, I forget what they're called. They're like little toy bugs, battery powered electronic bugs. There's a name for them. I forget what it's called, but they basically are just hex bugs. Thank you, Ray. So yeah, they're just like these tiny little things, no bigger than the head of a toothbrush, and they use a motor with an offset weight to vibrate, and then they have little legs so that when they vibrate, it moves forward.
I wonder if those motors.
Small enough.
I wonder if those motors were similar to what's used in cell phones for vibrating, because those are really, really small.
Yeah, there you go. That's probably what the hex bugs actually use, is the cell phone vibration motors.
Yeah. Those motors are used in a lot of tiny radio control cars that you can buy, the cheap ones. And they go very well if they've got enough gears, if they're geared down enough.
I recently saw a YouTube of a guy who built like a 180-something scale radio controlled car that drove and turned and everything.
Yeah.
It's like this small. Everything was like magnified, and he's using like tools and everything to do anything. It was insane that he actually got that functioning. So
if you look on YouTube, there's a chap on there that makes 1/76 scale and 1/43 scale, what we call lorries, you call trucks, for his model railways. They're radio controlled, they have steering, and they're very small. It just amazing. These days, miniature pieces to make these things run are quite easy to get hold of.
Dennis, you said that was a quarter of the size of the 1/32nd scale chassis, or 1/24?
It was a quarter of the size of the 1/24 scale chassis.
So that makes it 196?
196 scale, yeah.
Okay.
So what body are you planning to put on it then?
I wasn't planning to put a body on it. My skills when it comes to bodies are not where my skills are when it comes to chassis. So I would rather have that one just bask in its bare glory than try and cover it with something.
she wears that as a necklace. Where where does she wear that as a necklace? Is that like when she comes slot racing with you or something, or?
She has done, yeah, when she's at a slot car racing event with me or something like that.
People are like, oh my God.
Yeah, we tend to do that for each other. We make things like that every now and then. She's done some beautiful paintings for me over the years. She actually, for my 60th birthday, she worried me for a little while until I told her. I was asking me, "What's your favorite Can-Am car? What's your favorite Can-Am car?" And I'm saying, I don't know. Maybe a Chaparral 2E or something like that. And for my 60th birthday, I got this big flat present. I wish I could find that photograph. I'm not going to find it quickly. And she had painted me a Chaparral 2E Jim Hall behind the wheel at coming through turn 6 of Riverside. It's an absolutely gorgeous photograph. I'll see if I can find it while we're talking, and then I'll share again so we can see it.
Yeah, I want to see that, and it's awesome that you're still doing that for each other. My wife got tired of handcrafted leather stuff a long time ago, and she's not real receptive of 3D printed stuff. I don't know why. I mean, come on, I 3D printed you this cool thing.
Yeah.
Boy, there's so many places you could go with that, but I'm not touching it.
That would be a good thing, John.
Get alone.
I have a question for Lloyd, or anybody, as a matter of fact. It's kind of an odd question because I know absolutely nothing about 1/43rd scale. I was wondering if any 1/43rd scale cars run well on any 1/32nd scale tracks, Carrera, Electrics, or anything like that.
They pretty well all do. A lot of the proxies that are run on 1/32nd track. So particularly if you run with magnets, they run quite normally on there. But even if you run without magnets, if you've got decent urethane tires on, they'll run pretty well on any track. The only thing that affects that to some degree, if you're using variable power supply, you're fine with any car. But some people have had trouble running Artin cars on Carrera Go or Carrera Track, for instance, because the power supply isn't, the amps are wrong for it. The Artin car won't run purely because of the way it's been supplied, but under normal circumstances, they'll all run on pretty well any track you put them on, as long as the slot is there for them to run with.
So there's no problem with the width of the slot or the braids or the fact that Carrera's...
No, Carrera Go have pin guide sticking out of them. And I found that on my tracks, I've sometimes had to slim down that guide, trim it down with a craft knife to make it a bit thinner and a bit shorter, because it gets stuck on some of the turns. But that's all you have to do that.
Yeah, I've had a few. I still have a few Carrera Go. My son bought Carrera Go for his birthday at some point, and of course tried them on my Scalextric track. And those pins are a bit thick, and they would get jammed in the track.
Just have to trim them down a little bit.
Just got to narrow them down a little bit. Yeah, the SCX compact 1/43rd cars run fantastically. They've got a nice slide guide. The D Nano or the D slot, Kyosho D slot, run pretty good too.
Oh.
But yeah, as long as it's either you trim down the pin like Lloyd was saying, or you've got a wide slot like Carrera, Ninco, Policar probably has a nice wide slot. And Carrera 132nd/124 track, the rails are wide enough that you can run HO cars on it. So that track can run all of them. Tiny little HO cars, 143rd, 132nd, 124th. run fine on a Carrera 1/32 scale track.
It's a good track as well, isn't it?
It is pretty good. Yeah, I've got a set of Carrera, and I like the stiffness of it. I would probably paint it for better grip, but yeah, it's good. It's a good system. Does that answer your question, Ray?
Yes, it does. Thanks very much, guys.
Lloyd, do you know of any car
I found
that
the
doesn't-
picture.
Oh, awesome. Go ahead, share it. Share it, Dennis. Wow.
It's a nice painting.
Yeah, she did a good job. She's actually done a bunch of them for, this thing's in an album, so I could probably show you a couple of them. Oh, yeah, let me not go so fast. That one didn't last very long because she decided that she needed the canvas, and so she painted over it before I could sell it. I was trying to sell it to a friend of mine, and he decided, then he was humming and hawing, and she painted over it. So by the time he came back and said, yeah, I think I'd like that, it was gone.
Well, listen, that's what Microsoft does with operating systems. So don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Well, good thing you got a picture of it.
This one gave me a nice controller eventually, because I swapped the painting. I paid my wife for the painting, and then I swapped the painting with a guy who wanted to sell a controller. So that was pretty good. That one hangs in a friend of mine's house now in Southern Oregon that he commissioned from her. She's done a bunch of this sort of stuff. This is just there's one that she did just because she liked the car. She loves painting cars. Oh, these ones are really interesting. Just after Michael Schumacher had that skiing accident and was in a coma.
We are having hamburgers tonight.
Beautiful section. That was good.
Okay. And tossed salad.
Can we have hamburgers too?
I was about to do a takeout order. I don't know about you guys.
yeah. Was that fries or onion rings that you wanted, John?
Oh, both.
Right, you muted him. What about paintings?
So she did these 3 paintings. This is Schumacher's first Grand Prix victory. This was his first championship car, and that was his last championship car. And they're each done on a board that was about 12 inches by 8 inches high. And she did these acrylic paintings, and then she covered them with a casting resin that gives you, like they use for countertops and things like that. So they have this really, really deep shine to them, and they're absolutely gorgeous. They hang in my office now, upstairs in my work.
She's really got the cars in a nice dynamic.
Yeah, she has.
Too.
Yeah, she does really well with it. She did one. I'm not sure if it's here. That was fun. That one. That was a slot car body that she painted for me, and she painted the chassis onto the body. Right. So it looked like you were looking through the car into the chassis underneath.
So she was just looking at the necklace then.
Sort of. No. It's
That's not a jail door, John. Come on, get with the program.
Yeah. I think that's probably all. Yeah. Okay.
Wonderful.
That was good. Yeah.
Those are gorgeous.
Whoa, hold on. So does she sculpt as well?
She does a lot of ceramic sculpture, and at one point she was doing some wood.
Hold on, time out. There's your body maker.
Yeah, I know.
Does she still take commissions?
Not really. She hasn't done any ceramic sculpture for a while now because of the coronavirus, because she can't get down to the studio where she used to work. And the wood carving she stopped a long time ago because it was screwing with her fingers too much. But yeah, she's done a lot of very, very, very fancy things. But John, my wife was originally a PC board designer, so she's someone who can operate CAD systems very well. And
so she can sculpt, scan them, and then print them out.
Yeah, well, she won't even need to scan them. She can, if I give her something, she can draw up the drawings, and I can get them ready for my brand new 3D printer that I got this week.
Well, I mean, my best advice is forget the commission, go straight for the royalties.
What kind of printer did you get, Dennis?
I bought myself an Ender 5 Pro.
Ooh.
So that I had some fun setting it up at the beginning of the week. It's upstairs. It's not down here in the garage because I want to print inside where it's cleaner. You know, it gets too dusty and dirty outside.
Sorry, Dennis, you just got it?
Yeah, I got it on Monday.
Ender
Gone to the
5
dark side.
is the big square one, right?
Ender 5's the one with the big the cube setting, right? It has a 4-pillar mounting, and the printing plate actually the printing bed moves up and down for the Z-axis, and then the X and Y axes are along the top of the printer. And,
doesn't it have a relatively large print area, like 300 something by 300 something?
Yeah, it's 200 square by 300 high, I think. So it's
Really?
plenty. Not that I'm ever going to use that much.
I thought it was bigger than that. I haven't looked at the specs, so I don't know. But
Yeah, I don't recall now.
usually the only reason to do, having the plate be on the Z-axis is because it's going to be like a Core XY, and usually the only reason to do a Core XY is because you want a bigger print volume, because it's more stable and doesn't shake things up as much as a bed slinger, as they call it, a Cartesian printer with the bed moving back and forth. But
Have you thought about what your first print is going to be yet, Dennis?
Well, the first two prints are done because they were prints of parts for the printer. When you start reading about printers, the very first thing you find out is that there are things that the manufacturers haven't given you that might be a good idea. And so 2 of those were things that I printed. One was a strain relief cable for the cables that heat the bed that moves up and down, because it's this big cable that moves, and then it just plugged into the underneath of the bed with no strain relief. So there's this lovely little design out on Thingiverse, and you grab the file and print it. It took about 20 minutes. It fitted perfectly. It works absolutely great. And it showed me that all that I'd been reading about leveling beds and getting this done and getting that done, everything worked. So I was happy with that. And then the second one was, again, just a little shroud to protect the cables where they come out of the big control box at the bottom of the thing. But so now I'm going to start looking at slot car stuff. Greg's been helping, and Steve Hendrickson has been helping enormously. He sent me a couple of files today for some bodies, which I'm going to try and print over the weekend. So we'll see. I will be able to...
May we be so bold as to ask what bodies, or no?
One is a 350 Can-Am Ferrari, and the other is a Lister Jaguar. And I think I'm going to start with the Lister because I already have 2 350 Can-Ams. I don't need another one right now. But yeah, so I'll start with the Lister, I think.
So I want to say not all manufacturers, because I didn't have to print a darn thing from my Prusa for it to just start whipping out the awesome prints and not falling apart on itself.
Yeah, so you got a Prusa, okay.
But it's also quite a bit more expensive than an Ender. I probably paid more for my Prusa than you did for your Ender 5.
Yeah, so I bought the Ender 5, and I bought an enclosure for it, and I did buy a glass bed for the printing bed, but at the moment the regular bed seems to be working fine. But yeah, there'll be more updates as we go. I've already got some ideas in my head as to things that I want to print. As Greg said, little adapters and things, that's going to be the first thing, and then later on I might get into more stuff as I start to understand what the plastics can do.
Okay,
so
some of us are getting printer envy here. Okay.
To be fair, I have printed mods for my printers. They just weren't strictly required to not, break the filament or or break wires or anything like that. Yeah. But yeah, okay. Fantastic. So looking forward to seeing what you come up with, what kind of projects you do with it. So Slothead has a question. I'm thinking Luff is going to answer this one. Routed track question. When I got my sections CNC routed recently, I reduced the slot depth from 5/16 to 9/32 of an inch. Will this be deep enough for standard guides without trimming? What cars might have guides that fit a deeper slot?
I just answered him.
Oh, did you? Well, there we go. All my tracks have 1/4 inch deep slots.
The answer really is if it's all regular plastic cars, then apart from Carrera, I would think that everything will fit fine.
So 4/16 is how many 30-seconds?
Well, 5/16 is
If he does 1/4 inch slot, that's a 4/16, right?
So 932s that he's got there is already a 30-second deeper than 1/4 inch, so it's
Okay,
fine.
he's good to go.
Plenty. Yeah, no
That's what I was
problem.
thinking.
Well, I only use 3/8 MDF, so anything over a 1/4 would be
Yeah.
too much.
Yep.
Be risky.
Mine's all done on 1/2 inch.
Pretty much.
Yeah, 932 is
fine.
plenty. Probably even enough for a Carrera guide at that depth.
Yeah, most of the stuff that you buy right out of the box is going to be fine. If you start using, some of the aftermarket deep wood guides and stuff, you could have a little bit of a, the slotted deep wood guides just over 8 mil deep. So you might have some issues there depending on how clean the bottom of the slot is. But
And how high the car is, yeah.
Yeah.
But you'd know because you'd be buying that aftermarket. The slot car doesn't come with it.
And the difference between a 6 mil deep guide blade and an 8 or a 9 mil guide blade is there's no, if you can't keep your car in with a standard depth guide blade, a 6 or a 7 mil blade, another mil or so on the guide blade is going to make no difference whatsoever.
Yeah. Don't go put
Especially
a deeper guide in to keep your car in the slot. You need to slow down.
It's
Once
much
the
more
fully-
important to make the guide thicker than to make it deeper.
Yes, the depth of it is, an 8 mil, so that's almost a 1/4 of an inch. If your front end of your car is a 1/4 of an inch out of the slot, another 1/8 of a mil or something's not going to make any bloody difference to you.
Hey, Chris, I'm curious because I'm sure Scale Auto has those cow catcher kind of guides. Do you think that's beneficial?
No.
Nope. Nope. That's all we need to know.
Dennis is saying yes, and Chris is saying no.
Hey, Dennis, why do you think they're beneficial?
I think that the Scale Auto guide is a good guide. Whether the cowcatcher design at the front of it is beneficial over something that's straight up at the front is something that you can always talk about.
Right.
We used to do that on Palmer guides. We used to cut it back so it had that angle at the front. And the idea was, as the car was starting to tip, that it may catch the slot. But again, as Chris was saying, I think that you're probably right that if the car is handling well, then you don't need that. But the Scale Auto guides are good because they're strong, they're reasonably thick, and they're reasonably deep. And then they have that little angle at the front of the guide. From underneath, from the flat surface, it rises a little as it goes up to the front tip of the guide, and that's a good idea particularly when you're running plastic track, because then it'll just bump over anything that might be in the old scaly track. Some guy has 3 sections of classic scaly track in his sport layout, and then you want to be able to ride over those little cross strips that are underneath the slot.
Oh, yeah.
So what about a pin guide, for example? Is there any advantage to a pin?
Pin guide. The big advantage to a pin guide is if you come out of the slot a lot, because it's dead easy for the marshals to put the car back in.
The big disadvantage of a pin guide, if you come out of the slot a lot, is that it drops into the next slot very, very easily.
That's true. And you do tend to, you can twist braid and all the rest of the stuff like that. But the whole pin guide, philosophy, for lack of a better term, is you read a lot on the forums about guys using guides that are like 2 inches long and 2.5 inches long, and this aids handling and this aids handling. The only place that a guide will exert lateral pressure on a car when it turns is right in line with the guidepost hole. So if you take the bottom of your car and you put your car in your hand, push your finger sideways on the guide, if it's, you know, 1.5 inches in front of the guide, that just spins around and pushes either way. So that does bugger all for your handling. It's really only underneath the guidepost hole that does it. And with the guides, there's so many little, you know, the scale auto guides take some of the work out of the guides. As Dennis says, the sort of the chamfering on the front edge under most of the guides, I'll routinely do that with slotted guides. A lot of the other guides, the slotted guides, every single slotted guide I've ever seen, if you turn it over and look at it, there's a little bump on one side where it comes off the molding. So when you put your braid on that, the braids don't sit equal. And I can't remember if it's the left side or the right side, but whatever it is. So I think it's actually on the positive side of the guide. But if you clean those things off, if you know, the back edge of the top of the guide can be the blade can be chamfered down a little bit so it doesn't interfere with the chassis as it rotates. And I'll routinely spend 45 minutes on a guide before you get anywhere near close to the car.
What, 45 minutes just on the guide itself?
Well, you gotta make sure. I have a setup block, looks like a piece of slot car track with a thin slot milled into it with a piece of sandpaper on either side. So I put the guide in the track with sandpaper on top and run it back and forth to make sure that both the undersides of the guide are perfectly flat and perfectly even. I don't like sharp points on the front of the guide, so I'll radius those and, you know, make sure the top edge of the trailing edge of the guide is cut at a bit of an angle so it doesn't interfere and catch with the underside of the chassis. And there's all kinds of little things, you know, and I mean, I'm going to make this real quick. I don't want to take up too much of your guys' time, but everything starts with the guide. The guide holds the braid, which supplies the power, which holds and holds the car. So if you don't, there you go. Dennis has got one right there. So if you don't have the guide set properly and without wobble, and preferably with the nose of the guide 2 or 3 degrees up versus the rear of the guide, you can put in a guide and bugger up a good car real fast. Or you can help out a lot of them.
So conversely, you can have a mediocre car with a good guide and it'll run that much better?
Well, I mean, the guide is the thing that keeps the car in the track and picks up the power. So as much attention to detail as you can place on that, you know, we get a lot of proxies, and the amount of slop in the guide, side to side or front to back, cars going down the track and the braids are moving, and that causes arcing in the motor, which pits the comm and does all kinds of like just. But again, if you're building cars and you like watching them go around, and you know, they're going to be fine. You don't have to do any of this stuff. You know, this is you know, one of the guys in one of the Toronto clubs has been building a lot of chassis out of square aluminum tubing.
Oh yeah, I've seen that on the forums. Yeah, he's like milling everything out.
Yeah, and gluing the motors on and all the rest of the stuff. They go just fine. They do well in his group because the other guys think this is an advancement for them in terms of chassis. So, but they go fine. They go great. I mean, it's much more important to have a chassis that's flat and true and square. That's more important than the materials and the design philosophy in the chassis. I've seen really simple basic chassis done well, work great. I've seen some, marvelously high-tech chassis built poorly that are just junk. So anyway, I'm not going to go on. I'm not going to ramble.
No,
We've
it's
got
great.
some marvelously high-tech chassis that were built very well and they're still junk.
Well,
I've built a number of those over the last little while for a lot of trucks, and they were marvelously technical, and I think I could build okay, and they were still complete junk.
Hey, Chris, I just want to go back to the fascinating that you said about where the guide acts on the chassis, and I found that really interesting. So what do you think about sprung guides like Carrera guides that come standard in their cars? I always thought that the spring was to straighten out the guide so it's easy to reslot, but does that spring have any action on the car in cornering? Do you think that affects?
The amount of lateral pressure that those springs put on the guide to sort of self-center it is minimal, so that when you go through a corner with a 70 or an 80 gram car, that's not going to inhibit any sort of slip angles whatsoever. Sprung guides with a little spring in there that spring vertically are not a bad idea at all for a plastic track, particularly if you've got a really bumpy plastic track. But you can certainly duplicate that by running, if you've got a bumpy track, you can run the guide a little bit higher in the chassis, so there's a little bit more space there. So I typically take, when guys bring their Carrera or Scaly cars into the shop and they still have the springs on the guide, I typically just take them out. It's just one less little stupid thing to misalign and screw them.
I generally
Chris,
take them out of
what about
Carrera cars also.
I was going to say, what about the guides in the 60s that had, the almost like little fish hooks at the back for an elastic band for self-centering? Were those of any use at all?
Again, not from a handling perspective. The marketing behind it was probably more important than anything else. It did make sense if your car comes off the track and the rubber band in the Cox La Cucarachas and stuff straightened the guide out, you could put it into the track very quickly from a marshaling's perspective. Did it really work? No. But I mean, there's so much stuff. Slotted has guides, Professor Motor, TS, like everybody's got a guide. They're all the bloody same. There's not, if you had a well set up car with a slotted guide and then said, okay, I'm going to try the X3 904 guide, it's not going to go any better or any worse. It's basically all the same. There's a few things that are important in guides, but most guides you see, if they're assembled well and put into the car well, and Dennis makes, for any scratch builder, Dennis makes these really gorgeous little brass inserts of different internal diameters. So you get rid of a lot of slop in the guide, which is a really bad thing to have in the guide. But there's more marketing today in slot cars. Well, there was way more marketing in the 60s because there was way more car manufacturers. But a lot of the stuff you see today is absolutely 100%, what are we going to get the guys to buy tomorrow? Well, let's do this thing. And then, we're going to change all of our wheels from aluminum to flat black. And we're going to say it's zirconium coated hydroxide -3, which adheres better to super glue and actually is, it's complete crap.
So what you're basically saying is it's like dating in high school. It's not what you have, it's how you use it.
Well, that's the whole, there you go.
Oh,
For anybody who builds cars, or if you're converting some of your plastic cars, Dennis makes these in, the one on the right has a little, so if you're putting that into a hole on a brass plate, it's very nice to align and it sits up straight and nice. There you go, right there. So, and he makes these in different internal diameters, so you can use different guides, because slotted guides and scale autos, the post on all guides is not created equal. So you really need to figure out what you've got. And having a guide that is perfectly straight up and down and will only move laterally is very important in a slot car.
so
And
are
getting
those
rid of all
machine?
the sloppiness.
Yeah.
Oh, so are those machine, Dennis?
Yes.
Wow, nice.
Yeah. I took the plunge and had a run of them machined at a local machine shop, and it took about, I suppose, 6 weeks, and I had to take the plunge and have a second run of them made. They slowed down a little bit, but Slot Car Corner bought them by the hundreds at one stage, and they probably still got some good stock left. But I have some here, and I made them originally just as Chris was saying. I had them made in quantity with a 1/8 internal diameter, the inside hole, which is what all of the vintage guides were. And
Right, that's even like a TSRF is that.
TSRF is 1/8,
right,
yeah. And then what I do is I set them up in my lathe here, and I will open them out to 3.5 millimeters, which is what NSR and slotted is, or I'll open them out to 3.7, which is what some of the scale auto guides are, and I think the slotting plus guides are that size. Or I can actually make a special one for, which is a little more expensive, for the slotted deep wood guide, which has a much shorter post, and the post is quite markedly tapered. So I shorten the tube, and I actually go in with a taper reamer, and I ream it until it actually fits correctly on the slotted guide, for which you pay a couple more cents per tube, you know. But yeah, that's what they are.
I think Chris makes a very good point. My scratch building, which is really mostly what I'm interested in these days, 90% of the time I use the TSRF guide, either as it comes or with a modification suggested some time ago by Al Penrose of cutting off the post after threading it, and then reattaching it with a 1/16 inch wire brace right to the front of the guide for cars which have a very restricted space at the front end. And I try to use as long a guidepost as is possible, just for the purpose of keeping things square. I typically don't use a machine guide. I'm more apt to use a piece of 1/8 inch ID tubing soldered into place with in an appropriate jig.
I'm not sure if I think Pato's place in Australia still has some Gamakatsu guides, which were trailing guides.
I have a few of those.
Okay.
Last time I looked at Pato's spot, they were not showing any.
Okay.
The problem with those, and they're very nice guides, for situations where you really can't fit anything else, they work very well. The problem is, of course, that they have a very, very short quote shaft on them, and it's a bit tricky to get them to square up nicely and run smoothly with an appropriate washer and so forth.
That's why you need the Dennis Sampson handy dandy little guide tubes.
Good point.
Which leads me to my next question, Dennis. Are you still selling them direct? Are you still selling the customized ones? How does somebody get one? You're muted.
Can't hear you. Dennis.
You're muted, Dennis.
Sorry, guys. Yes, Greg, you can order them from me. You can check on Slot Car Corner. They may still have some in stock. Because I think when Christian closed down Slot Car Corner Canada, some of that stock came back to the US. And they may still have some there. But if you need some, yeah, get hold of me either on the forum or at samsonclassics@gmail.com. SAMSON classics@gmail.com. And they're $2.95 each, plus $4 for shipping.
What's your forum handle?
But that's real money though. That's US, right?
Oh yeah, that's real money. Yeah,
Okay.
US money. Yeah. What's my what, Greg? Sorry.
What's your forum name?
Gas Car Nut.
Okay, a bit of history.
All right, Al.
Okay, back in the day, and this goes back to probably about 1959, there was a question, in my mind of how to get around the unfortunate gimbaled guides that the Scalextric cars used. And I came up with this, which is a piece of Teflon machined to a T shape. And then with a small piece of phosphor bronze attached to the front with optical screws, and then eventually, when I got to a different track, braids soldered onto it. And these are relatively shallow. They still work very, very well indeed. I like.
Now, does it pivot or is it fixed?
Oh, it pivots.
Okay.
Let me see if I can take it apart. I'll show you how it pivots. Basically, there's a piece of tubing that runs up. The tubing surrounds a 256 machine screw inserted from the bottom of the guide and then capped off with a nut and a washer at the top.
Thank you.
This is one of the machined aluminum chassis of the era.
So does that actually predate guide shoes?
Honestly, I don't, John, I don't know where I got the idea, whether I'd seen something similar or whether I thought it up myself. All I know is that it basically just happened.
And you said that was 59, Al?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, that was, you're a trendsetter there, buddy, because there was no such thing as guide blades in 59.
Well, I guess it just seemed a logical thing to do.
You're not rich.
Your work, because I didn't patent something, your work is shaped by the tools you have at hand.
There you go.
I was in a university department at the time. We had a fully equipped machine shop with a large Bridgeport mill. So that was the tool. And, everything that I thought about doing immediately translated into what could be milled.
And was it actually Teflon or was it nylon in 1959?
No, it's Teflon.
Teflon in 1959?
Yeah, very rare material at that time. I still occasionally make them. They're a fair amount of work to make, but they work as well as any guides that I've found since then.
Okay.
I have experimented some with questionable results. You can buy adhesive back Teflon tape. And I've experimented with thinning down a guide blade and then folding a piece of this adhesive back tape over it and sticking it down. The thought being that the less friction there is at that point, the better. I'm not sure that it makes that much difference. Part of the problem, of course, is that, in 1959, I was 23. Now I'm 84, arithmetic more or less. and the results may more reflect a decline in eye-hand coordination than changes in the physics of motion.
What I found there, I've been wrapping guides with Kapton tape because it's a lot easier to stick and to fold than Teflon tape and easier to get hold of. And I've noticed a very, very slight, and this is the case of, it's maybe 1/2 of a second a lap difference between a guide that has the tape on it and a guide that doesn't, and that's on a 1/24 scale car. So I think on 1/32 scale cars the difference is going to be negligible. But that's on these that's on the guides that I do that have the tungsten weights inside them, like that.
Right.
So I mill a slot in the guide, and I fill it with these little tungsten pellets and encase them in a UV activated acrylic or acrylate resin, and then I wrap them with this Teflon tape both sides. It adds about 1 gram of weight to the front of the car below the surface of the track, and I think that it's a wonderful marketing thing to make me some money. How much difference it actually makes, but I've got a lot of guys who've convinced themselves that it does make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they're the same people who bought Dysons.
Well, I remember going to the U.S. Nats and several years ago, and Paul Pfeiffer, who was one of the better pro racers at the time, had purple anodized guide nuts, and we all had gold anodized guide nuts. And Paul Pfeiffer won the U.S. Nats that year, and purple anodized guide nuts were flying off the shelf.
Yeah, that's pretty nutty.
Yeah.
Oh, ouch. That's.
I had to. It was like clean in. You should have heard what I wanted to say.
And on that note, we're at our 2-hour mark. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording and let you guys chat away. If you're watching at a later date, come next time and join us. Oh, Lloyd, you have a last minute thing you want to toss in?
No, last night on the 143rd Zoom, we had a lot of talk about guides because our cars don't have a lot of power, and putting a guide on to causes too much drag can make quite a lot of difference. But I won't go into it now because it's a long subject. But it's 2 o'clock in the morning here, so I'm going to bed.
All right. Well, we look forward to more 143rd chat and guide talk on the 143rd chat, so people can join in on that. And until next time, everybody can wave bye-bye, and we'll say adieu. Adieu.